Hello, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Have you ever stopped to think about how just one voice, one person's viewpoint, can totally change how we see history? Or, how a fictional story can just grab you and feel so intensely real? Well, today we're kind of pulling back the curtain on perspective, how it shapes pretty much everything we think we know, whether that's like an ancient battle or the latest novel. We're exploring the incredible power, but also maybe the surprising blind spots of seeing things through the first person, through the eye. And to help us get our heads around this, we've got two really interesting sources. First, there's this website aptly named Eyewitness to History. Its whole thing is history through the eyes of those who lived it. And second, a really detailed article from Story Planner for Writers called What is a First-Person Narrator?
Yeah, and what's so fascinating here, I think, is how these two areas, historical accounts and writing fiction, they seem different, right? But they actually shed light on each other in really interesting ways. Our mission today really is to unpack not just what a first-person perspective is, but the profound ways it shapes how we understand things, how it makes something abstract feel really immediate, really personal, and maybe, sometimes, deceptively complete.
Okay, let's dig into that Eyewitness to History site then. It definitely pulls you in right away with that promise, your ringside seat to history. It's published by Ibis Communications, Inc. And yeah, the goal is delivering history through those direct personal accounts. And they really do. They highlight these turning points in history. I mean, imagine Julius Caesar right there at the Rubicon in 49 BC saying the die is cast. You almost feel the weight of it. Or, oh, that heartbreaking plea from Archduke Ferdinand's wife. Just awful. Sofra, don't die. Stay alive for the children. Right after he's shot in 1914. And bam, that basically kicks off World War I. It's so raw.
It is. And what's really striking about hearing these moments directly is how it just strips away all that academic distance. Instead of just dates and facts, you're hearing from people who are there. You feel the human emotion. Like, take that chilling quote they have from a knight. This is 1250, Seventh Crusade. He just says, I gave him a thrust with my lance just under the armpits and struck him dead. Stark. Or, switching gears completely, the Great Depression. There's this photo of the week, riding the rails, 1940 Guayig, and the quote from this young guy. He said he quit high school after 2 years. I'm on the bum. These aren't just summaries. They're these immediate, visceral snapshots. Powerful stuff.
And they don't just have text, right? They've got snapshots and voices of the 20th century. Actual film clips, too, like the U-boat attack 1917 or the Hindenburg explodes in 37. Even the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor 1941. Actual footage. It really does make you feel like you're right there seeing it happen. But hang on, that night's quote, I struck him dead. It definitely puts you in the thick of it, yeah. But doesn't that also mean we're only getting his side, one perspective? Does the site ever sort of grapple with that limitation, or is the focus purely on that raw immediacy?
That's a really excellent point to bring up, because that immediate feeling, that sense of presence, it's absolutely critical. It taps into our deepest instinct about authenticity, doesn't it? If someone says, I saw it happen, we tend to give it weight. We often believe them. And this inherent credibility is exactly why primary sources like these are so incredibly powerful in history. It really goes back to the very roots of how we tell stories. Someone recounting what they personally witnessed or experienced. And funnily enough, this is pretty much the exact same mechanism that fiction writers use. When they choose to tell a story through a first-person narrator, it leads us right into our second source, actually.
Okay, so we've seen how these first-person accounts can ground huge historical events in, actual lived experience. But this Story Planner for Writers article by Ariel Lopez, it takes that same idea and flips it. It shows us how writers intentionally use this power in fiction. So how does the article break down the actual craft of choosing a narrator?
Right. The article makes it really clear from the start. A first-person narrator is always a character inside the story world. They're telling the story from their point of view. And it's usually either the main character, the protagonist, or maybe someone who's watching the main action unfold. And it stresses there are two main types we need to distinguish between.
Right, okay. So the first one is the first-person protagonist narrator. The article says this is often a big reader favorite, yeah, because it creates that instant feeling of closeness. The main character is leading the plot, and they're telling us their own story, directly using I.
Exactly. And the absolute core thing here is subjectivity. The viewpoint is inherently subjective. So what does that actually mean for us as the reader? It means we are totally immersed in their feelings, their thoughts, their biases, and judgment. We simply can't know objectively what other characters are thinking or feeling deep down. We only get filtered through that narrator's personal lens. So the article suggests if a writer really wants you to feel a character's grief or maybe their guilt after losing someone, well, telling it through their eyes in the first person is incredibly effective. It's all filtered through their unique internal world.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for writers. The big challenge then becomes giving that narrator a totally unique voice, right? One that feels completely separate from the author who's actually writing it. Like, think about the opening lines of Paul Auster's Moon Palace. I was very young back then, but I did not believe there would ever be a future. I wanted to live dangerously. Bang, you're instantly in his head. Or Haruki Murakami's Killing Commendatore. I couldn't figure out why the portraits were being received so well. I was less than enthusiastic. You're not just reading about them, you're right there with them, experiencing their specific take on the world. So for a writer, getting inside a character's head like that must be, well, incredibly powerful, but it's got to be challenging too, surely. What does a writer maybe lose by deciding to stay only in that one character's head?
That's a fantastic question, actually.
Hmm.
Because while you gain all that intimacy, that closeness, the biggest thing you lose is, well, breadth of perspective. You're literally confined to what that one character can see, hear, and understand. And that limitation leads us neatly into the second type the article discusses, the first-person witness narrator. Now, this character is also in the story. They're observing things firsthand. But crucially, they are not the central figure. They aren't the one driving the main plot forward.
Ah, okay. So they're kind of like the reliable sidekick, maybe, or a friend who's always nearby. They're telling us what they saw, what they know, often watching the main events from, like, a slight distance.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Spot on. The witness narrator still brings that really important credibility. I mean,
Wow.
they're telling you what they saw with their own eyes, right?
Yeah.
But the critical difference is they provide distance, some separation from the protagonist or the core events. The article uses Dr. Watson narrating Sherlock Holmes as, like, the perfect example. Watson describes Holmes, sure, but he often idealizes him, or he highlights Holmes's weird eccentricities. It creates this aura of mystery, this larger-than-life feeling that Holmes himself, narrating, probably wouldn't convey in the same way.
Exactly. Yeah, you wouldn't get Holmes saying, gosh, I'm the most perfect reasoning and observing machine. That sounds arrogant. But Watson steps in and says he was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen. It feels completely different for us as readers. It makes you wonder, actually, if Holmes had written his own memoirs, would they have been nearly as engaging? Maybe just a bit too full of, well, obviously, and I told you so.
Huh? A very real possibility, I'd say. And that really gets to the core paradox, doesn't it? The witness narrator's perspective, just like the protagonist's, is still ultimately subjective. And it's limited. They can't be everywhere at once. They can't fully know or understand the protagonist's deepest emotions or motivations. Plus, they have to maintain their role as an observer, mostly, and as the article really stresses, they still need their own distinct voice. The article even breaks it down further, mentioning different sort of flavors of witness narrators. You might have an impersonal witness who just records facts, almost like a security camera. Then there's the eyewitness like Watson, who observes but also interprets what they see. And maybe an informant type who presents information in a more detached, almost official document style. Each one gives us that first-person view that I saw, but with different levels of personal filtering and interpretation baked in.
Okay, so we've walked through these historical eyewitness accounts, these direct voices from the past, and we've explored how writers use these first-person narrators, both protagonists and witnesses, in fiction. So the big question now, maybe for you listening, is what does all this mean? How does it connect to how we take in information every single day?
Right. And this, for me, is where the real aha moment clicks in. What this deep dive really tells us is that whether you're reading, say, a chronicle from the 13th century, or you're reading a news report filed just this morning, or you're getting lost in a novel, that first-person voice, always brings something unique. It brings immediacy, authenticity. But it also always brings an inherent blind spot, because it's never just what someone saw. It's always filtered through how their own biases, their position in the world, their feelings, their very being, how all of that shaped what they observed and how they chose to tell it. So when you encounter a historical eye, or frankly even a politician's eye, you're not just getting a pure fact, you're getting a curated experience. The real insight here isn't just that these literary and historical uses are similar, it's that this similarity should fundamentally change how we approach all such first-person information. It demands a level of critical thinking, of questioning the perspective, that maybe we usually only apply to fiction.
That's such a crucial point, yeah. It definitely changes how you might read, say, a diary entry from a famous historical figure, you start seeing it less as pure objective truth and more as a really powerful, yes, but still filtered personal account. And it's a pretty good reminder when you're just scrolling through social media, too, isn't it? Every single "I saw this happen" post is really just one tiny subjective slice of a much bigger, often way messier reality.
Exactly right. These first-person perspectives, they offer that invaluable intimacy, that authenticity. They really pull us into the moment. But precisely because they're so personal, so subjective, so limited, they actually compel us to engage our critical thinking more, not less.
Yeah.
That really profound quote from Socrates, which, interestingly, we also found on that Eyewitness to History site, sums it up perfectly. The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Mm.
It's fundamentally about recognizing the inherent limits of any single viewpoint, including our own.
So from the raw immediacy of a crusader's battlefield account to the innermost thoughts of a fictional painter, these first-person narratives are just incredibly powerful tools. They offer us this unique window into reality, both historical and fictional. They breathe life into stories by inviting us directly into someone else's lived experience, making things that feel distant suddenly seem very close.
hmm And while these personal perspectives are just invaluable for that immediacy, for that emotional connection, it's always worth remembering that every single eye offers a limited subjective view. It has to. They don't just tell us what happened. Crucially, they tell us how it felt to that person
Mhm.
and how it was understood by that individual in that specific time and place.
So maybe the next time you encounter any kind of story, whether it's in a history book, a news article, a documentary, or a novel, don't just absorb the information passively. Maybe just pause for a second. Ask yourself, whose eyes am I actually seeing this through right now? And how might that single unique lens be shaping my own perception of what's true? Something to think about.